Yeah, well, thank you very much for your kind introduction and especially for having me. I try to start my PowerPoint presentation and I hope it will work. So now here we are. Yeah, that's the right one. What I'm going to present today is part of a book project on the economies of knowledge that is concerned with the Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC, in the first half of the 17th century. The company will be analyzed as a formation in which different epistemic cultures thrived, but where the norms and practices of the company imposed the criteria for what constituted valuable knowledge and determined how it was acquired, processed, and used. Since the history of knowledge is a very extensive field of investigation, even when confined to the VOC in the early 17th century, I'm focusing on the choreographical knowledge. In modern terms, this includes elements of geography, hydrography, topography, as well as social, cultural, and economic geography. Today, I will pick out two closely interconnected aspects. Firstly, the attitude of the company's directors towards the knowledge of their employees. And secondly, the question how and why this became part of an internal regime of secrecy. In the course of this, I hope it will become clear why I think it fitting to speak of an economy of knowledge when looking at this company. I hope the tone is okay, just a question in between. You understand me correctly? Good. Then I'm going on. So let's start with traveling back to Amsterdam of the year 1620. Arnold van Buchel sits at his writing desk. Unfamiliar place names have turned up in the reports from the East Indies. Now he tries to find out the location of the places. He noted in his diary that Jambi on Sumatra is situated on the river, quote, unknown in the common maps, but depicted in the company maps. Priyan Mai, however, I have not yet found. This scholar, who actually specialized in genealogy and heraldry, was an extraordinary director of the province of Utrecht in the Amsterdam Chamber of the Dutch East India Company from 1618 to 1621. He liked to talk to the company's cartographer Gerrits in order to expand his geographical knowledge. Thus, his diary is full of fascinating entries about geography. Sketches of maps bear witness to his geographical interests too. He was aware that there was more knowledge available within the company about the geography of Asia than anywhere else in the Netherlands. However, he did not understand the attitude with which his co-directors handled this knowledge. They are very saucy and jealous with their secrets, not understanding that what so many people know can be hardly concealed, and that some of equally great importance have already become common through printing. This obsession for secrecy seemed naive to him. We shall not concern ourselves with the question, who was the naive one? Yet Van Buchel's diary proves that there was an interest in geographical knowledge amongst the directors, but not in an open exchange of that knowledge with scholars and the public. Quite to the contrary, around the time when Van Buchel was writing, a transformation of knowledge, of the knowledge culture in the Dutch East India Company took place, and a phase began in which the directors tried to enforce a regime of secrecy. Van Buchel, by contrast, was devoted to the free circulation of knowledge. To him, the ideal vision of the VOC was the concept of the Mercator Sapiens, the learned merchant who profited from various branches of philosophy and shared his knowledge in turn. Caspar Barleyus devised that concept in his 1632 inaugural address for the Athenaeum, the Luster School of Amsterdam. In the history of science, Barleyus is most often referred to in the discussions about the connection between long-distance trade and the scientific revolution. Harold Cook, for example, did so in his well-known Matters of Exchange. This reverence, however, is problematic as this connection is not covered by the address and furthermore Baleo's vision of the merchant who shared information in order to have it interpreted by scholars did not exactly agree with the views of the merchants, at least not with the views of the majority of the Fayose directors. Researchers evaluated the knowledge acquisition and processing that was carried out in the companies strikingly different, depending on their disciplinary approach. Economic historians and historians of cartography regard the Amsterdam Chamber as an important place of information gathering and processing. In contrast, the history of science was dominated for a long time by an image of the company as one whose employees performed outstanding scientific work, but which at best provided the infrastructure for this. Klaas van Berkel, Harold Cook, Siegfried Hauchen, and Adrian Delmar denied that the company was an organization with any scholarly ambitions or even interest in knowledge-producing projects. Matthew Sargent, on the other hand, recently assessed the projects of the employee as, quote, symbiotic public-private partnership. Duke van Natten went one step further and characterized the Dutch long-distance trading companies as scientific enterprises. In that line, Anna Winterbottom called the English East India Company even an experimental community, and argued that it used the same knowledge practices as the Royal Society. According to her, both kept detailed records of their meetings, gathered information from an extensive network of correspondence, circulated it again, adding to and correcting it, and then used it as fundament for experiments and theories. However, one also could conclude that such practices are not specific to the scientific field. It also seems questionable to me to evaluate the knowledge cultures of trading companies according to whether and what they have contributed to the increase of scientific knowledge, or to compare them with scientific societies, which means that they were judged according to criteria that are alien to them as an organization. Rather, the knowledge culture of the Fayose must be accessed through its own records. However, before we further look into the records, I should introduce the company itself. As its name suggests, the United East India Company arose from a merger of older companies in 1602. Over the course of a few decades, it developed from a high-risk venture into a secure financial investment with guarantees returns. This allegory, painted by Nicolas Vercollier in 1702 for its centenary, illustrates the self-image of the company that the company cultivated of itself. The picture shows the company at the height of its power. At the beginning of the 17th century, this was still in the future, but the beginning of this self-image goes back to that time, as we will see. On the left-hand side, the personification of trust, which was to connect the six chambers of the company, refers the viewer to the personification of the Amsterdam Chamber, enthroned in the center. Behind her on the left, looking slightly patronizing, stands Mercury, god of trade, money, and communication. Below her on the left, looking slightly, below her, looking up to her with reverence, lies the personification of navigation. Behind navigation, two putti are visible, whose cornucopia contains some of the most important goods that trade and shipping brought to the company. Spices such as cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and mace, which the company was even able to monopolize. The personification of the Amsterdam chamber is endowed with numerous attributes that, like the crown and a raised sword, refer to governmental powers. The company appears as an empire of trade and as a colonial power. That it did not achieve these roles on its own is also represented in the picture. In her left hand, the chamber holds the privilege of the States General that granted the monopoly on trade in an area that covered no less than the entire zone from the Cape of Good Hope to the Magellan Strait. The actions of the company were founded on borrowed authority in a double way, since on the one hand it was based on monopoly privileges of limited duration granted by the Dutch Estates Assembly, and on the other hand, as a joint stock company, it was subject to fluctuations of its stock quotation. The painting, however, emphasizes permanence and refers to its foundations: military strength, economic success, and divine providence. Meanwhile, another foundation is far less explicit: knowledge. It is represented only subliminally, unless we are to take the ship. Sorry, here should, yeah, now it turns up. Unless we take the ship next to the Pillars of Hercules as a reference to Francis Bacon, who famously adorned his Instauratio Magna with a ship sailing through the pillars. Multi patransibunt et augebitur scientia. The ship in the painting, however, is unfortunately passing by the pillars, and probably rightly, for Bacon spoke of science, whereas the company was concerned with knowledge that provided a foundation from which it could operate. The board of directors responded to the epistemic challenges of expansion with differentiated and continuously adapted instructions for the practices of recording, representing, evaluating, and administrating knowledge and information. Profound reflections on the limits of their ability to know or limitations that were given by the prevailing methodology are very rare in the company files. They only become visible when knowledge was controversial, uncertain, or deficient. Only in these situations did explicit ostentations of validity seem necessary. In consequence, when someone explicitly addressed a form of knowledge, kennis, vetum, or informasi, it often was in the form of a wish for it, a complaint about its absence, or prophylactic reservation. The use of language in the company did not differentiate precisely between the various forms of knowledge. In my study, I do not understand knowledge as something timelessly and diachronically stable, but as something dynamic. Therefore, I use the concept of knowledge claims and analyze which statements were considered knowledge or non-knowledge. These claims were made in specific situations and were embedded into the knowledge culture of the VOC. According to Lauren Daston, a knowledge culture is characterized by, I quote, at least implicit systematics of knowledge, starting with an epistemological hierarchy often intertwined with a social hierarchy of which kinds of knowledge are more or less valued, end of quote. Within a company that had so many different fields of actions as the VOC, and which employed people with such a wide range of skills and trainings, this knowledge culture encompassed different epistemic cultures. An epistemic culture refers to a specific style of thinking of a group that shared ideals about what proper knowledge actually was and how this knowledge and its knowers should be handled. We see actors rivaling each other for rank not only within but also between hierarchies and negotiating their standing, also via the claim of special knowledge and the possession of certain epistemic virtues. For example, when the company cartographer and the examiner of the pilots on the one side fought about maps against the pilots on the other side, then this was not only a question of proper cartographic projection, but also a fight about who qualified to be the expert on geographical knowledge and deserved more money than the others for that expertise. Their claims of what was proper knowledge were not only at odds, but both sides tried to convince the directors that their way of knowing was the best for the company's aim, safe travel. In this case, the cartographer won. However, it is evident that the company's directors imposed the criteria for knowledge and the rationales for dealing with knowledge claims. From their instructions, reactions to reports, and questionnaires, it is clear that the FAOC preferred up-to-date knowledge based on experience. The instructions emphasized the duty to report all economically usable facts and findings from the very beginning. In 1607, the merchants were instructed to read memoranda compiled from the existing material carefully and examine them and to investigate their truths. In addition, they were to explore new places. The aim was to corroborate and refute dubious knowledge, but in any case, to increase knowledge. The aim was explicitly to promote the profit of the company. The lack of knowledge about the geography of Asia was thought to be a temporary one. 1623, for example, the Governor General reported that 5 ships departing from Japan in late October got into great trouble at the heights of the pescadores and only arrived at Batavia after losing several anchors and much cordage. The reasoning was given that, quote, the Chinese coasts, which are not well known to our people, are too much shunned. The Chinese, however, would travel back and forth there all year round. He concluded, with time, ours will also learn it better. Besides optimism for the future, this also shows that missing knowledge had financial consequences. This was an argument that the employees themselves had internalized. They repeatedly demanded that maps be improved. Henrik Brauer wrote in 1612 about islands that were missing from the maps and warned, it is too late to complain when the misfortune had happened. Eliminable gaps in knowledge could be the source of scandal and become part of cost-benefit calculations for knowledge. The prerequisite for this was a belief in the perfectibility as expressed in correxy, a favorite word of the directors. Maps and knowledge stocks were constantly corrected, but so were employees, for whom this word was normally associated with a loss of wages. Congruently, employees that had acquired experience with Asian trade and waters got higher wages or promotion. For them, the upper limits of the pay scale of 1617 quickly became the starting point for negotiations. Nevertheless, in 1622, dissatisfied shareholders complained that the FAOC paid too little for goods services and had therefore lost employees with knowledge acquired through long experience. They rated depriving oneself of such experts as foolishness. Losing expertise was not only a loss to the company's capital, but it also contained the threat that somebody else might profit from the expertise. Knowledge about both the company and its area of operation could leak out, and there were many competitors in the Netherlands as well as outside who were very keen to learn what the company knew about East Indian waters, its places and peoples, resources, and trading practices. Therefore, the disloyal employee was the boogeyman of the directors. Oaths of secrecy, indulgence towards smaller breaches of rules, and higher wages should prevent such disloyalty. However, this was not only a simple intersection of economy and more or less expert knowledge. Taking the social dimension of knowledge into account, we get a more sophisticated, Bourdieu-style economy of knowledge. Knowledge was a capital that could be converted into money, but also into rank and reputation. It had a symbolic dimension too, of which the directors were aware, as becomes obvious when one looks into their intended regime of secrecy on the one hand and their symbolic use of knowledge on the other. As mentioned, the Fayousei depended to a certain degree both on the political will of the States General and on the opinions circulating in the stock market. Information and knowledge thus were not only instrumental for operating and deciding, but the director also felt a certain necessity to present themselves and the company as knowledgeable in order to stabilize the institutional standing of the Fayousei. They had to decide carefully how to represent the company in Europe and which pieces of instrumental knowledge and information should be disclosed to whom. To be clear, the issue here is not what knowledge were actually circulating, but what the directors thought should circulate. Thus, I avoid approaches to the public sphere instead refer to research on secrecy and agnotology. Scholars studying secrecy in early modern age have until now mostly attempted to differentiate between certain forms of secrets according to their scope of application: arcanum, occultum, mysterium, and the more worldly secretum. This, was, this has led to important insights, which are, however, of little relevance here, as I'm dealing with just one form of secrecy, the one termed secretum. This comprises the deliberate concealment of knowledge that is available and thus knowable as such. To take something actually knowable out of circulation is the goal of any regime of secrecy. Peter Galison has coined the term anti-epistemology to describe this phenomenon. He used it to analyze the classification system of the 20th century US Army that tied secrets to degrees. The classification was organized according to the potential harm that data could cause if it fell into the wrong hands. The documents were stored according to different categories. In the process, decisions were made about how much of it should be secret, from whom, and for how long. Gallison's neologism can be criticized, especially for its inherent politics. But what is stimulating is his differentiation of secrecy and its direct as well as collateral consequences. The intention of concealing certain stocks of knowledge proves a reflective handling of them, as this requires considerations of their potential danger and value. Furthermore, secret knowledge is always valuable knowledge because it is socially exclusive. Daniel Jütte has even spoken of an economy of secrecy during the early modern period. Especially in the context of an economy of knowledge, secrecy has social functions, regulating access and creating exclusive opportunities for those who had it. We can assume that the directors were aware of these correlations when they experimented with the concealment of specific contents around 1620. Unlike the meager testimonies of the protocols of the VOC, Van Buchel's indignant comments allow us to glean a certain system in their approach. What was supposed to be concealed was, firstly, things that could be potentially be harmful for the company. In 1620, for example, the advocate warned against handing over a written report by a former governor general to the States General, as for him it was certain that it would only end up in wrong hands. For Van Buchel, this procedure was scandalous. After all, the company was accountable to the States General. In September of the same year, the Heeren 17, the highest managing committee of the company, resolved to remind all accountants and servants of the secrecy of documents through which the company could suffer harm. Van Buchel thought that this only caused wonder that their business dealings aren't all too legal and that they want to conceal this from the shareholders. The information to be hidden concerned the commercial operations and the profitability of the company, the publication of which dissatisfied shareholders were demanding loudly in their initial conflicts with the directors. Furthermore, Van Buchel bemoaned the concealment of geographical knowledge. The directors connected this with a scenario of military threat. They didn't want to see topographical descriptions published, being of the opinion that this would open up the places to the enemy and allow him to catch them by surprise. The scholar thought this absurd, but for his colleagues it was obvious that in an economic and political context, geographical knowledge could only unfold its distinguishing power if it was exclusive and unprinted. Thus, they filed an application for its protection, which the States General granted on February 12, 1619, with a privilege. The legitimizing reasons named in the application are revealing. The company would daily promote the discovery, notification, depiction, description, and position of all shores, states, capes, roadsteads, ports, rivers, with their size, width, depth, and breadth, as well as other qualities, circumstances, and wares of all the aforementioned lands and islands of East India. For this, it bore excessive efforts and costs. Through the printing of its maps, journals, nautical letters, and drawings, however, these places had been, to its great damage, made public, known, and common to the entire world. This had already led to increased competition from surrounding princes and republics. As long as the company's monopoly stayed in force, the States General ordered that the publication of such works should be permitted only to the company itself, whereas all others were forbidden to, quote, reproduce or reprint in any language and sell it or import it elsewhere made for selling it in the United Provinces, in whole, in parts, in large or small, without the consents of the directors. The competences delegated to the company encompassed firstly a privilege for publications, secondly a privilege for censorship, and thirdly, the States General withdrew all existing printing privileges for works concerned with the VOC's territory. The only withdrawal of an existing printing privilege the company requested was for the works of Jan Hauchen van Linschoten, which had been explicitly mentioned as a negative example. According to the request, publishing such secrets was forbidden in various kingdoms and countries because of the inconveniences to be expected. This proved that other nations were aware of the fact that the dissemination of such knowledge was dangerous. The Dutch, it was argued, couldn't allow themselves to fall behind in the efficient protection of knowledge. Such lines of thoughts weren't entirely new in the Netherlands. Numerous privileges protected inventions and discoveries. They can be traced back to ideas of business secrets and of intellectual property. Usually, it wasn't the inventor or discoverer who decided what would become of the results of his efforts, but rather the person who had paid for him. Along this line, the first East India companies had already insisted that they were the owners of all achievements made by their employees, and therefore the ones who were entitled to decide on their publication. Enforcing this required increased efforts, especially in the field of nautical knowledge. For pilots, for example, who thought that the market value of an individual depended on his experience, the order to transfer special knowledge was an affront. This view was not restricted to sailors. In the Oude Company, all merchants, scribes, under-merchants, pilots, and under-pilots were compelled in 1598 through sworn articles of employment to hand over all journals, maps, notes, and drawings they produced or collected during their journeys. Additionally, everyone was required to swear that they would not proceed into the service of other traders. Provisions like these were implemented into the articles of employment issued by the VOC. Therefore, the exclusive right of publication of 1619 is a logical consequence of the claim to the knowledge of the employees. The right to censor was a further protection in the case that this claim couldn't be entirely enforced. In their decision on the request for privilege, the Herren Servantine spoke of persons who wanted to print company-owned maps, journals, nautical handbooks, rudders, or other descriptions established in a historical manner. Indeed, a first collection of Dutch travelogues appeared in 1619, which had this aim. The Oost- and the West-Indische Voyagien, published by Michiel Colijn. In the preface, the publisher promised to imitate other nations which had, quote, their voyages in the aforementioned Indies embellished historically and brought it into a corpus. On top of this, he even promised a second volume that would report, besides the journals, different treatises on the locations, fruits, animals, constitutions, law, etc. of the East Indian lands as well. This second volume was never published, and it isn't entirely improbable that the privilege stopped it. Besides Colijn, however, the far-reaching printing privilege issued to their own cartographer in 1618 was a thorn in the director's side as well. On January 24, 1618, Hassel Gerrits submitted a petition to the States General in which he requested that all his products should be protected. 3 days later, the states prohibited reproducing his maps, geographic descriptions, and models of maps, written as well as printed. The petition alone already shows that he intended to stay active in publishing. What the company had to expect is illustrated by an engraved map that showed, besides the Malayan Islands, the discoveries along Australia's western coast made until 1628. It is dated anno 1618 in Amsterdam by Hassel Gerrits with privilege. All the preserved copies are from later than 1618, but there is evidence that the depictions of shorelines that were discovered later are additions on a plate engraved before February 1619. The privilege of February 12, 1619, however, annulled all the privileges, including the one of Gerrits. Kees Sunfleet assumed that Gerrits had voluntarily relinquished his privilege to the company. This is speculation. However, although he was a person who had formerly been a simple cartographer of the Amsterdam Chamber and otherwise one of several map suppliers, just 2 months after their petition, the company did employ him at high wage, and they guaranteed this position for as long as he would serve faithfully. For Gerrits, the increased financial security also meant the loss of parts of his privilege, as well as a loss of his freedom to publish. Still, this arrangement promised him a secure income and access to the materials of the Fayouses for years to come. The company, meanwhile, bought his silence. Through instructions and pledgings his oath, the cartographer was obliged to keep everything secret and, quote, not to publish or disseminate anything directly or indirectly without the knowledge and the written approval of the company. Thus, the company had not only secured one of the best cartographers for its service, and so laid the foundation for its team of experts, but had at the same time obliged him to maintain their regime of secrecy. Not all employees, and not even Gerrits, stopped their publishing activities entirely. The directors targeted unauthorized travelogues in particular. This quickly revealed the problems of the privilege. The authority to impose censorship measures was held by a number of political, legal, and ecclesiastical councils, not, however, by the Fayouses. Thus, they had to appeal to the respective council that seemed in charge of the matter. Yet already in the first case it tried, the company failed to enforce its censorship. On May 15, 1619, they submitted a petition to the States General to have the recently published travelogue Oost- en West-Indische Spiegel by Joris van Spielbergen prohibited. Spielbergen had sailed around the world in the service of the Fayouses. In his report, however, the Heron claimed to find many falsehoods and the same infringed upon the privilege. The author, though, was clever enough to dedicate his work to the Prince of Orange and the States General. Instead of prohibiting the book, the States General rewarded him with a gift of 400 guilders. It was, however, the last report released by a fleet captain of the Fayouses. Thus, the attempt to take control of publishing was only moderately successful, but the company convinced the majority of its employees that they were not allowed to publish without the director's approval. This claim persisted even after the privilege had expired. In 1689, for example, the director reminded the printer van Zomeren that as their employee, he was not allowed to print any maps of Asia without their consent, as he had intended to do. Where the privilege had only been insufficiently effective because the political authorities had not allowed themselves to be permanently enlisted for the company's goals, the path via the articles of employment apparently proved a good alternative. The company continued its secrecy regime even without the borrowed authority of the States General, but now based on property and duty. Such an eternal regime bound the company's directors too. Nevertheless, it remained important to present the company as knowledgeable. Here it is important not only to consider the instrumental use of knowledge that was immediately applicable in on-ground operations, but also the symbolic capital of knowledge claims. How this could be cashed in is very well illustrated by a festival report written by the aforementioned Caspar Barlaeus. In 1638, Maria de' Medici, Queen Mother of France, visited Amsterdam. The whole town was buzzing with excitement. Triumphal arches were erected, plays enacted, and sightseeing tours organized. The response in the media reflected these efforts. Reports in newspapers, series of copperplate engravings, and 2 festival reports were published. One of the latter was Barlaeus' report. Therein, the visit of the House of the East India Company, which was praised as magnificent and great, received much attention. The company did not just impress its visitors with illustration of its dominions, but by appealing to all senses. Long tables were set with varieties of fruits, spices, exquisite textiles, lacquerware, gems, and other goods that East India had to offer. Barlaeus described how the queen touched these things. Furthermore, Asian delicacies were served on china plates. That not only pleases the palate, but it is also suitable for rejoicing the eyes and the nose. The result was that Maria de' Medici felt herself truly transported to Asia. The company presented Asia both through the senses and as something sensual. For persons of lesser rank as well, East India became an experience in the houses and warehouses of the Fayose. Here, the objects and goods could be viewed, felt, and smelled. Asia was communicated less through an examination of Asian cultures, appealing to reason, but as a sensual experience of its products. The approach to the other exhibits in the East India House in Amsterdam emphasized this. The terms used for its possessions in travel guides, city description, and travelogues already shows a considerable lack of precision. For example, they report that one of the paintings showed the glamorous court of either the King of China or the King of Japan. Differences like the one between China and Japan or the one between king, emperor, and shogun didn't seem of any importance. In almost every description of the East India House, the weapons on display were mentioned. Their origin, however, was never named exactly. While Japanese sabers were specified, all the rest were strange and foreign weapons. The objects and illustrations served as substitutes for entire cultures and continents, and thus became what Christoph Pomian would call semiophores. In this way, the company, on the one hand, exploited the exoticization of Asia in its self-representation, and on the other hand, created an image of itself that combined power and mercantile knowledge. Barlaeus described the Fayose as a company that was powerful that knew how to procure the valuable goods and sensual pleasures of Asia and also knew how to showcase them. He depicted the company just the way it wanted to be seen. This was also recognized by the directors, who gifted Barlaeus with 750 guilders, a huge sum, in consideration of his praise. After the meal, the Queen of France was presented with gifts such as china and lakewares. Correct gifting was an art form that was based on the assessment of one's own as well as the receiver's status. The company represented itself through gifts that served as signs of knowledge. What was given away on such occasions was carefully selected. Each chamber had to search for its finest items. In 1639, for example, each of them was ordered to choose from the porcelain it had received the quote, finest and choicest as gift for the Princess of Orange. The gifts of the company served as signs of knowledge in several ways. On the one hand, they carried embodied knowledge that was inscribed in them, and on the other hand, they referred to Asia. But ultimately, they also illustrated the knowledge of the qualities and values of the objects that the gift givers possessed. Most gifts given by the company, however, weren't collectibles but luxury commodities. Although this reduced the exceptionality somewhat, it still showed the practical mercantile knowledge of the Fayousay. They proved that these merchants were able to recognize exquisite objects, to trade for them, to transport them without damage, and to store them properly before they reached the receiver. The buying and transporting of exotic goods, in particular, were not necessarily the standard abilities of well trained merchants. The company had paid the price for these lessons as well. For example, when spices had been contaminated during transport, silk had faded, mercury had leaked, or what should be indigo turned out to compound of dirt. What at first glance seemed to be basic skills for a company trading in the East Indies became a form of knowledge specifically connected to the Fayousay once the rarity of both these abilities and the possibilities for implementing them are considered. This also made the company a prime contact when unusual objects were desired. It could procure luxury items, exhibits for cabinet of curiosity, or rare animals and plants. Decisions about such requests were usually taken by the chambers without hesitation. Yet, if the requested item was a map or topographical description, the matter was quite different. The company relinquished such objects of knowledge only very reluctantly and to a limited circle of receivers. This also goes for persons that would usually have been receivers as a matter of course. To present the great pensionary Borel with China was a given for the Chamber Amsterdam in 1636. His request for maps, however, caused them to hesitate. He was referred to the Heeren Servantine, as the bestowal of maps was a matter, quote, which was of which this chamber could not dispose. Even when the wish was just for illustrations of the establishments of the company in Asia, the powerful Chamber Amsterdam referred to that committee. In 1639, it passed on such a request by the Prince of Orange. This not only makes clear that these media were rated as of special importance, that the regime of secrecy was still in force, and that first of all the chambers themselves were bound to it, but it also illustrates that the authorized bestowal of such knowledge was an honor. Official gifts of maps are accordingly very rare. The company thus did not esteem knowledge that was common, but valued the knowledge that it possessed exclusively. In this way, Barleios' Mercator Sapiens was only an ideal that merchants could allude to, but the Fayose had little interest in realizing. It was the same author, however, who also designed another image of the company, one which exoticized Asia. East India became the realm of the senses, a frenzy of colors, tastes, and smells. A powerful company brokered its products and thus became an institution to which knowledge was ascribed. Knowledge of geography, navigation, customs of trade, transport, storage. It was known that the Fayose knew, but not what it knew. The regime of secrecy, which was well known, after all, the company had the privilege of 1619 printed, opened up much room for assumptions about its wealth of accumulated knowledge. Under these conditions, an equal exchange with scholars was neither possible nor necessary. The Fayose was interested in knowledge, but not in the free circulation of the knowledge necessary to trade successfully with the East Indies, which to the director was most of all one thing, a capital, which was best stayed silent about. However, within the Fayose, we see various uses of that capital by single actors as well as groups that all had different rationales and interests, which influenced how they acquired, processed, and shared knowledge. The directors were only one, albeit quite powerful group in this economy of knowledge. Thank you very much for your attention.